you're a brilliant researcher. You have done amazing work into the whole question of what is Atlantis, where is Atlantis, what lies behind the myth and the story of Atlantis. You've got some amazing YouTube videos that you've posted over the last few years, and you've written amazing posts. That's why I first got to read your work, your posts on the Graham Hancock message board. And it's actually fantastic to meet you, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So, Matt, how did you get interested in this question, and where did you start?
Okay, sure. I was watching the Randall Carlson podcast that he made about Atlantis, which are probably a really good place to start if anyone wants to start learning about Atlantis possibly being out in the Atlantic in the Azores. He did a great job presenting a case for the lost city of Atlantis being somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. And I thought, well, I know that whole region has been scanned in great detail with bathymetric data. Ships have been out there for decades. They've been taking scans with side scan sonar, and the image has recently been made freely available over the last decade and in a digestible format. So you no longer just see one tract of data. You can almost look at it as if you were looking on Google Earth, and you can look under the water now in that region of the world. It's pretty well surveyed now. So I thought, well, if something as big as Atlantis, which Plato describes a circular city, which is 5 kilometers in diameter, I thought I'd have a look for it. And I was surprised to find something almost immediately in the center of the Azores Plateau. Seemed to be a very, very close match to what he described in his dialogues.
Yeah. So the Azores are several thousand kilometers off the coast of Portugal, aren't they?
Yeah, they're actually a Portuguese territory. I think it's about 7 islands, and they're based around the mid-Atlantic ridge on the Azores Triple Junction. So it's a highly sort of active area, tectonically.
Yeah.
I believe the Portuguese have been in occupation for the last sort of 650 years. It was an unoccupied region. But there are people, professors, not archaeologists, but there's physicists and other professors at the Azores University that believe they found things out there that are
It's a very remote
pre-Portuguese.
place, isn't it?
Yes, it's out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
But if you knew where it was, and or where they were rather, and you were trying to cross the ocean, they'd be a really great place to stop and sort of regroup and get ready for the second phase of your journey.
That's right. And there are, of course, megalithic remains there and pyramids, aren't there?
Yeah, there's 140 pyramids on the island of Pico. How old they are is under debate. Some people are saying they were just piles of rocks that were placed there by farmers when they first occupied the islands, but I think there's good reason to believe they're much, much older. And there's even evidence for stone anchors out there. So the sort of anchors that people would have been using thousands of years ago rather than hundreds of years ago.
So it's very, very old. And of course, being volcanic, it's famous for its very sheer rock faces and steep hills, steep inclines. So I presume the water gets very deep very quickly as well. So it makes it difficult to find things underwater, I suppose.
Yes, it doesn't have the same sort of shallow continental shelves that we have in Britain and Ireland. It's you almost immediately plunge into deep ocean, just hundreds of meters off of the sort of beaches and coastlines.
Yeah, it's a probably very amazing place to dive, but very difficult to find evidence because everything gets so deep so quickly. So what's the best evidence then to point us in the direction of the Azores in terms of the story of Atlantis, in terms of the words that we've got from Plato or anyone else?
I think Plato does a good job describing the lost city of Atlantis being outside the Pillars of Hercules. And in the time of Plato, the Pillars of Hercules was represented by the Straits of Gibraltar, because the Pillars of Hercules represented the sort of edge of the world to the Greeks. So it has been in different places, but it looks like by the time of Plato that did represent the Straits of Gibraltar. So he says the island is beyond.
So it makes sense to look beyond the Mediterranean as opposed to within the Mediterranean. And as so many people do who maybe try and think that maybe there's something to the Atlantis story. They look in Greek waters and they don't go very far. Was what you're suggesting is you can leave the Mediterranean behind and you can actually go much further.
I think so, yeah. And some of the research I've been looking at, I'm suggesting that there are what are called geodetic alignments that can cross the Atlantic. So I think certain sites were built in key locations around the world so that people could use them for navigation or for, looking at the sun and looking at the moon, so they can know exactly where they are on the Earth, so they can navigate using very simple tools.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually a concept that came back into vogue in the 17th and 18th century, I think. Do you remember the story of the transit of Venus observation? So various parties of scientists went out to all four corners of the Earth to try and observe the transit of Venus in the mid-18th century from different vantage points so that they could make their calculations even more precise. So that idea is actually very interesting, that it might go back much, much further. And in terms of these connections then to other places on the Earth, what have you found?
It might be best if I share my screen and just bring up Google Earth, because that'd be
yeah.
a lot easier than just talking about it. I've saved a bunch of folders on the left-hand side. So
I see your first two points are Atlantis Island and High Brazil.
yes, High Brazil is something I've been looking at. No, I'm not totally convinced there was something there. It's just something I'm interested in.
Yeah. No, I thought your video was very good the last time. That was one of the latest ones, wasn't it? The on High Brazil, and I thought that was very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think I think High Brazil could be some sort of mirage that people have seen, but it doesn't look like there's a lot out there. It's hard to say. I think there could have been, build up of coral banks effectively that have been eroded over time. So if there was something there, and the only geological explanation in my eyes is the buildup of coral, because that part of the world, it'll be around here somewhere if we're talking about High Brazil. But that part of the world, it is famous for its coral banks, and some of them are known to grow hundreds of meters tall. So
yeah,
it is possible there
was a very interesting video you did on that. I thought that was very plausible actually, and very restrained. You don't go rushing in saying, "Oh, this is High Brazil," this is it. I thought it was very, very interesting. But having said that, the maps that we find this particular island on, they coincide with other parts of those maps being, Antarctica is not under ice. This is a very, very different world we're looking at. So
yeah,
you don't know what really the situation would have been in those days. It might have been very, very different, and it's very hard to find traces of these things.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to it for me with High Brazil. I think if it did exist, it was a coral mound which no longer exists. The sort of temperature changed. The cold water corals could no longer accrete, as it were. They could no longer build up, and effectively those structures were eroded away. And we know that those particular kinds of corals can't exist at these sort of depths here, but we do find that they have migrated into the Porcupine sea bight down here because it's deeper and colder. So if High Brazil was a thing, there is an explanation for it. I'm wondering if what we see on the maps of High Brazil is they do look like they're in. I haven't put this on my video, but it looks like they're in the same location. You might even be able to see them here. There's a feature here and another feature here, and those are some sort of rocky outcrops that probably wouldn't be covered in sand. And it turns out that sailors sort of 500 or 600 years ago would do depth sounding with tallow on the bottom of a lead weight, and they would sometimes look for features like this, and it would tell them how far they were from the coast. So it could be that they weren't islands; they were depth soundings potentially, but it's something that's worth looking into. I mean, there's so many myths and stories about High Brazil, not only in Ireland, but there's other Celtic nations in Britain have got similar stories.
But just because there's a myth about something doesn't mean to say it is only a myth.
Yes, there could definitely be more to it, and I think it's certainly, once the technology exists, it's probably something that should be investigated further.
Yeah, and I guess what strikes you when you look at these very old maps is how many islands there are on them that are now no longer visible. So either someone was very happy inventing islands at the time, or they simply have disappeared. So
Yeah, I think there have been a case of islands disappearing. I mean, there's definitely been up to 140 meters of sea level rise over the last 20,000 years. So we do know oral traditions can stretch back tens of thousands of years. It's not something we're so familiar with in the West in modern times. Aboriginal Australians still have stories that are 50,000 or more years old, they're being told. So there could have been information that was handed down orally. There could have been records kept elsewhere. We know there was a lot of stuff that was lost in the Library of Alexandria, possibly other libraries as well. So
other
it is
languages as well.
plausible.
And in the Mabinogion, there's a story of the Welsh crossing over the Irish Sea with one step. Well, it's a giant who does this, but just one single step. So maybe that's a memory of when there wasn't quite so much water between Ireland and Wales.
Yeah, I mean, it does make you wonder all of these stories about giants. What does it represent? Does it represent, something, symbolic? Is it maybe there was another culture on Earth? Probably wouldn't go as far as to say civilization, but maybe there was another culture on Earth that was more advanced. They were seen as intellectual giants, or maybe they were just bigger people. I think there were tribes of Homo heidelbergensis that were over 7 foot tall. I mean, there might have been bigger people around.
Yeah, I mean, there could be several very banal explanations. You're right. So tell me about this large green mass that you're showing us now.
Okay, I've kind of crudely drawn on Google Earth here what's called the Azores Plateau. So the Atlantic is mostly empty, apart from a few islands, but there's a region here where the three continental plates meet. They're actually drifting apart. They're divergent plates, but about 20 million years ago, they started to produce continental crust instead of oceanic crust. If you look under the water, you'll find it looks a lot like a sunken landmass rather than an ocean basin.
And this is an area that's in constant movement as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there could be geological explanations as to, this actually could be a gigantic sunken landmass. Like I said before, if you watch the Cosmographia podcast, there's papers that are getting pulled up on that podcast showing that beach sand is found in places that you wouldn't expect to find it. So it could be sunken land masses. I think there's evidence for wave cutting at deeper depths than we'd be accepting, today as being true. But it's hard to say if that's relatively recent. That could be millions of years old, and so there could be an explanation behind that goes against what I'm trying to say. But I think that this here is potentially a large sunken landmass. You'll see on Randall Carlson's podcast, he talks about isostasy, where the actual plates move up and down as load is distributed laterally across them. So if ice is removed from, say, a landmass, say like North America, that landmass will begin to rise, and there'll be a corresponding drop in the ocean because weight's moved into the ocean. I don't think that by itself is enough to explain how something could sink 2 kilometers or more. I think you'd have to look at something called bottom loading isostasy, where there's an upward force that's been lost. And what is actually known geologically is that there is a 200-kilometer wide hotspot under the Azores Plateau. And that is now in a period of what they call waning. So it's not, it's no longer as active as it used to be. And perhaps there was a great deal more pressure under this landmass at one point, and it could have potentially helped push it out of the ocean. There might be other geological mechanisms as well. Something I need to research a bit more. I've got some ideas, but I'm not comfortable talking about them right now.
Sure.
you
I
could.
mean, there's already so much research you have done that we can talk about. How did you come across what these how did you determine rather the size and the shape of your landmass? Because the
Okay.
story of Plato is very specific. It's about one particular city on the one hand, and then there's also the continents, and it's the size of Asia and Libya put together. Isn't that right?
Yes, he does say that, but obviously when we think of Asia and Libya now, we're thinking of something completely different to what was
Yes,
described
there
in
were
the time of
different
Plato.
Asias and different Libyas between now and then.
So yeah, Asia would have been a small part of the Middle East, and Libya. I'm not sure if there's an exact definition for Libya, but it would be a decent portion of parts of North Africa. So probably parts of northern Egypt, this part of what's modern day Libya. I don't know how far it would go. I don't know if it would include all of North Africa, but it
But
certainly would have covered this region here.
yeah, that would make sense. So it's something in the region of the size of Spain or France, would you say, or maybe the UK?
This is probably a couple of times bigger than the UK if you include all the water in the middle. If you filled in sort of Irish Channel, I can't remember what you call it. Is the Irish Channel?
Yeah. So the Irish Sea, you have to be
Irish
careful.
Sea, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, if that was filled in, it would be about the same sort of size as all of
Yes.
this combined.
Yeah.
But a very
Yeah,
sizable
that's right.
landmass. Yeah,
Yeah.
not just a simple island. It's it would be a legitimate country.
And the various cities that you, or the various towns that you have marked out, they're the towns on the present day islands.
Sorry, say again.
The towns that you have marked out are the towns on the present day islands. So you have Pico, I see, and Santa Cruz de Graciosa. They're the main towns that exist now.
Yes, yeah, I've just got that ticked on Google Earth, so you can turn on borders and places. So those are
Yeah,
just
that's handy because you can place it in relation to what's there.
yes, yeah. I'll turn off
Yeah.
the islands there.
Oh, I see. You can see it there very well. Yeah.
But I've basically overlaid. I can turn it off. Google Earth isn't really great for bathymetric data, so I've extracted this from two different bathymetry sources and combined them and placed them where I'm saying this feature exists. So I can turn it off. You can see if you follow this track here,
Yeah.
Google Earth does have one bathymetric survey of the area, but it doesn't have the other one that went across this way. And what I've done is I've combined both of those surveys into one overlay and placed it over where I'm saying this round feature is. It's very low resolution. It's about 1,800 meters deep. So when you do a bathymetric survey, to get that deep, you have to use fairly low frequencies, and that gives you quite a low resolution. But hopefully you can get the gist that there is a circular feature here.
Yeah.
Another one here. Plato
Yeah.
describes a third canal, which should be around here. Whether or not that exists is another matter. The resolution, to be honest, is actually too low to capture that innermost canal if it does exist.
So what does Plato actually say? So there are concentric circles.
Yes, he says there are concentric circles of land and water, and they are around a central mound. So the central mound he describes as being 5 stadia in diameter, which is just under a kilometer. Then that's surrounded by a circular canal, which is 1 stadia, 185 meters in diameter, or not diameter, in width. And then there's a section of land outside of that, which is 2 stadia wide, another canal, which is 2 stadia, then a 3 stadia width of land, and then the outermost canal is 3 stadia. And if you actually look at this, I mean, I have uploaded it into CAD software, and it's almost an exact match size-wise to what Plato describes. You just don't see the third canal in the middle. It's interesting because you've got... Sorry, carry on.
What do you think would have been the purpose of these canals? He doesn't really say, does he?
I think basically you've got Poseidon in love with a native girl that lives here or something, and he digs some canals to sort of isolate her from the rest of the island. Whether or not that's through love or something more sinister, I don't remember that part of the story so
Well,
well.
the Greek myths can get a bit.
Um,
So what about the red area that you have marked out?
okay, so yeah, that's from the bathymetric scan that's come out from over here, but it shows that there are what looks like to be water sources or rivers or something that are coming in to actually feed these canal systems, these circular canals. 'Cause the water has to come from somewhere. If you actually look at the depth data on here, not just on Google Earth, you need something a bit more accurate. It looks like that water's coming in from an elevated position here, moving down, it's filling these canals, and then there's an outlet here, so the water leaves through there. It's interesting. I mean, I don't know enough about the geology to explain what this might be. I think it's too deep for turbidity currents. So if I just explain quickly what a turbidity current is, if we go back to this part of the world here, Porcupine Sea Bite, it's famous for its sort of underwater canyons. It's sort of like almost the starter place that geologists learn about these sort of features, but basically you get underwater, like very small underwater landslides where you get turbulent water that is full of sediment, and they start to carve out their own canyons and they become self-sustaining, and they just, as they fall into deeper water, you get these canyons, but they start
So
at
you talked about
relatively.
these in your last video, don't you? The one about High Brazil, and you explained that they're not actually, remnants of rivers from when this area was above water or anything. This forms naturally underwater.
Yeah, these form naturally underwater. So
Yeah.
they tend to start in quite shallow water where there's enough movement to set them off, and where there's enough sediment, and then they sort of tend to self-sustain themselves. But I don't think they would tend to form at a depth of sort of 2,000 meters, which is sort of giving me reason to hope that possibly this is actually something. It is what I think it is. There's definitely something geologically different about this to the surrounding plane on which it sits, because you can actually look at gravity data for this region. So the whole world has been scanned with satellites, and sort of there's a gravity map where it detects the most minute changes in gravity from one area to another, and there's more gravity here than there is around here, which would indicate that there's denser rock underneath here. So I suspect that if this is something that's partially man-made, it's built around some geological feature that was already there.
So how does that work? So it affects the gravity because it's denser.
Because it's denser, yeah. So normally, if you look at a hill or a mountain on a gravity map, just because of its size, you can see extra gravity. But this is at the same height as the surrounding plane. Really, it's not it's not high enough to explain why it's significantly higher on the gravity map. So the only explanation is that there has to be a denser material, a denser kind of rock here than there is around here.
Okay, that's very interesting. And so how then does this site relate to the other islands that are now existent, and also then the wider countries beyond that, or any points from the ancient world maybe that might relate to it in some way?
Sure. So I think the closest island is Fayal Island, and it's about 50 kilometers away. So it's quite far away from anything that exists, in the present day. Does sit at the same latitude as those 140 pyramids that are found on Pico Island. They sit around here on this region of this island. It's actually quite a special latitude, because there's a lot of features that, there's a lot of sites in the Americas and in the old world in Europe that sit at this particular latitude.
Yeah, no, that the idea that a particular latitude would be important to ancient sites isn't widely accepted, but I think it's a very interesting idea. And what else would be on this latitude?
So the most obvious place to start probably would be, actually, let me bring them up. Okay, so you have Delphi, which is it lies on the
That's the major
slopes
one.
of Mount Parnassus, and I actually think Mount Parnassus is more important than Delphi because the summit of Parnassus, which is here, actually lines up much better with a lot of the places I've found around the world. And there's actually a story behind Mount Parnassus. So there's the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, and they sort of survive the flood in Greek myth, and their boat washes up on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. So there's already a myth behind
That's right.
behind that
And is
location.
there something about the abode of the gods before they went to Mount Olympus as well? Was there a connection to Mount Parnassus? And I may be getting muddled up, but
I
yeah,
don't know.
I think that whole area.
There's a lot of myths around mountains in sort of Greek, storytelling and tradition. So I don't know enough about it, to be honest. I've been very focused on what I'm particularly looking for.
Yeah.
But obviously Delphi is famous for its oracle. People have been, in ancient times, were going out there to seek the advice of the oracles.
Mhm.
There's also another
Absolutely.
interesting story behind Delphi. Obviously, it's famous for Apollo, but if you look behind the story of why Delphi is associated with Apollo, it's because he slew the former guardian, which was a serpent, which sometimes goes by the name of Python, or I think Pythia, depending on the story. So it's either a male or a female, but the stories are very similar. It's the god Apollo comes and he builds his own temple there and takes over. But Delphi is the home to the Omphalos stone, which is the navel stone, so it represents the center of the earth. I've been looking at some research. I just happened to be sort of looking into Vitruvius, and there was an ancient Roman engineer, probably around about 50 BC. He was an architect and engineer. He was very familiar with Greek architecture, Roman architecture, and Egyptian architecture. And he explains that temples are sort of a reflection of the human form. And he describes the proportions of the perfect man, which has been drawn by many artists. The most famous is obviously Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. And so if you look at Leonardo's drawing, I'd recommend you don't bring up if you edit this video, don't bring up Leonardo's drawing because you can get sued now. People are losing a lot of money. It's been taken out of the public domain, and it's been.
Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
I thought it was public domain. No. So I thought
Not,
something old as old as that would be. No, okay. There's always
so I
big
think
money with Da Vinci.
yeah, I think an Italian museum has somehow got the rights to actually start suing people for this. And there's a famous jigsaw company. They've been making jigsaws of Vitruvian Man for years, and they've had to pay out a hefty sum, for what should be in the public domain. So don't show it. I'll just describe it for now. But basically, if you look at the Vitruvian Man, you find the navel is at the very, very center of the man when his arms are outstretched and his legs are outstretched. It forms a perfect circle. And the 2 points that the man touches on this circle correspond to the same latitude as Delphi. Basically, the latitude at which Delphi sits, if you cut a cross section through the Earth, the arc that is formed by the latitude of Delphi, so I'll zoom out so you can see it here, that the chord that would go through here is exactly 1/4 the Earth's circumference. It would make geodetic calculations make them simpler for people that didn't have what we have today. So we have irrational numbers. That means we can use decimal places to represent any number of any magnitude. And in the ancient world, people had to use fractions to subdivide things. And if you have simpler numbers, it makes the mathematics a lot easier for people that didn't have the sort of tools that we have today. So that might be a reason why they chose this latitude. And it just so happens to coincide with the proportions of man when his arms are outstretched. So you're gonna have to use your imagination for a moment, but if you imagine a man with his arms and legs spread out here like Vitruvian Man, his fingers touch here and here. I'm not saying that Da Vinci knew about this latitude or even Vitruvius, but it would seem that ancient temples were probably built around concepts of divine proportion that is seen in various life forms, including our own. Yeah, I think the evidence is starting to really mount up for me personally. Something that I should explain is that many of the world's most important sites are at latitudes of sevenths from the equator. So,
which is again something John Neal found, I think.
Yeah, I know that
initially.
John Michel's been looking at things, like this in the past. I don't know where all of the origins come for this, but then there's been people like Hugh Newman, Howard Crowhurst, the Heath brothers, Richard and Robin Heath. They've been looking at these same latitudes.
Yeah.
And the world's biggest stone circle is at precisely 4/7 of the way from the equator to the North Pole. So that's Avebury. And this will actually show you how precise that is. That's exactly 4/7 of the way from the equator to the North Pole.
As far as I know, that initial finding with Avebury goes back to John Michel and John Neal.
Yeah, I definitely know John Michel was involved in that one there. But that you've got that, and then you start to go down to the next line of latitude, which is the one that Delphi's on, and what I'm calling Atlantis is on. And so not only is Delphi and Mount Parnassus on there, you have Almendres Cromlech, which is a couple of thousand years older than Avebury. I mean, Avebury is 5,000 years old, or the beginning, the first part of Avebury is 5,000 years old anyway. But you have in the Evora region of Portugal, you have a place called Almendres Cromlech, which is here.
Right.
I know there's bigger complexes than Almendres Cromlech, but I believe this is still the largest group of standing stones in Portugal and probably the whole Iberian Peninsula. So those are 6,000 or 7,000 years old. And they're on that same latitude again. And I'll tell you some more relationships regarding those in a bit. Interestingly, the sites that I've been looking at seem to be related to this Ricat structure here. And it may explain the origins of why circles are so important. The Ricat structure is a giant group of concentric circles, 40 kilometers across. As far as I'm aware, it's the second largest group of concentric circles formed in nature that we know of. If there's any others, I'd like to know about them. The only one that I know that is larger is Lake Manicouagan in Canada, which is here. This is an annular lake. This is even bigger than the Ricat structure, 72 kilometers. Interestingly,
these are geological formations as a result of impacts.
I don't know enough about the Ricat structure. It's either volcanic or some sort of salt dome or something that's eroded over time. This one here, though, is an impact that happened something like 100 million years ago, 200 million years ago. It's very old, but over the last few millennia, as if by some sort of stroke of luck, by magic, these sites are exactly 1 radian apart from each other longitudinally. So they're 57.27 degrees apart in degrees of longitude. That's exactly 1 radian. And we still use the radian today to represent proportions of a circle that are not dependent on any unit of measurement, which means that people, if we describe something in radians, somebody in the future can understand it if they don't use the degree system that we use today. And nature has just somehow, by absolute fluke, provided us with the 2 largest circular features in nature that are exactly 1 radian apart. And
Yeah.
you have the here in Britain is the largest man-made stone circle at exactly the same latitude as the world's largest geological circle. I
It is an
really don't.
interesting coincidence.
I don't think it's a coincidence when you start to look at the relationships. So everything's in sevenths. And before I carry on with the sevenths, I'll tie that back to the latitude of Delphi or the omphalos. Because if, as I said earlier, this represents, imagine that was a cross section and that was a chord rather than a circle. That's 1/4 of the world's circumference. In the ancient
Right.
world, I think there's evidence in the ancient world that they used 22/7 for pi. And what it would mean is if that's in sevenths, so 1/4 is 7, so a whole circle is 28. And that would mean the Delphi latitude is exactly 22. So you could have equal lengths or equal segments you could use as like a standard measure for distances between places. And that measure just happens to be 888 miles. So it's 888 miles between each seventh this way. And then that ring of 22 is 22 times 888. So you've got a system that you can use to measure these distances between places. Something I've not mentioned anywhere yet before is I found a degree relationship east-west, something I've only recently discovered, of 18 degrees between these sites. So the Ricat structure here is exactly 18 degrees longitudinally from the center of Atlantis. And when I say 18 degrees, I mean 18 degrees. I don't mean it's off by a little bit. It would go straight through the middle here. That's it seems to me that some sort of feature, natural feature that was here was chosen to be turned into something, a bit bigger, into some sort of a geodetic measurement point. So I do think it's based around a natural feature. There are hills and other things here, but some things happened here where they found out, well, this place is 18 degrees away. Let's use this natural thing here and build some canals around it. So
So if many of the ancient sites were indeed connected by these nice numbers in terms of either degrees or radians or sections of a meridian or whatever particular natural feature it is, this would actually make sense in terms of this particular feature being connected with at least some kind of ancient site.
I think so. I think when you start to see the same numbers turning up over and over again, it starts to be something that needs to be investigated more seriously. And just to balance the argument out, people have made the point that there's so many ancient structures in the world that you can form any relationship you want. So we need to be very careful when we talk about these sites, that we point out that these are the biggest of their kind, or they're the most sort of significant in terms of being almost like a spiritual capital for the people that came later in more modern times. When I say modern times, I'm talking like 2, 3, 4,000 years ago. If this is man-made, or at least if the canals are man-made, this would be even larger, much larger than Avebury. Again, it fits this criteria of being the largest. To the west, again, precisely 54, not quite as precisely, but precisely 54 degrees west. We have a feature here. You can tell I've done this a few times because I can just zoom in on it now. Let's just describe this whole region here. This is Kentucky. There's lots of valleys and sort of hills that I don't know enough about the geology, but I think these are all formed by glaciation and deglaciation. So at some point during the consecutive ice ages that have happened over the last 2.5 million years, ice has formed and melted, and you get these valleys and peaks and troughs. And there's one that stands out from all of the rest. You can see it here. You don't see it anywhere else. What you'll notice, what people have done in recent times, is anywhere where it is flat, they will build farms or houses and gardens, and everywhere that's too steep is covered with trees.
Mhm.
And it looks to me like there was a ridge here that's been removed. You know, it's not just pareidolia, it's not the same as the rest of the ridges. You know, there's a ridge here, it's not been, you know, it's still there, and that bit seems to have been removed. This sits at that same latitude. This is exactly the same size as the central mound that Plato describes for Atlantis. So again, is it another natural feature that's been embellished by people?
Now, this is always
And
the question, but that's a very interesting site. So I presume you found that by just going along your line of latitude very, very gradually and looking
yes,
at all
yeah,
the features
yeah,
in a
I've
very
basically, yeah,
painstaking way.
yeah, I've basically gone around the whole world where there's land and just looked, and this is one place that stood out for me. And again, recently, I've very recently found out this is actually 54 degrees west of my Atlantis, and
Amazing.
that 54, so that's 3 times 18 degrees. So it's like there's a 20-degree system
And
going
it's
on.
half as 108, which is a very important number.
But yes, yeah. I think it's interesting. So 18, if you split 360 into by 18 degrees, it's you get 20. And the Mesoamerican people, and it's increasingly looking like other parts of the Americas as well. I'm not saying everyone. They were using a base 20 system, which might explain why you see, you know, 18-degree relationships. That 54-degree line actually hits here, so it's not quite
Okay.
as accurate. But I think, you know, if, in my opinion, people were doing these measurements with things like gnomons and totem poles and even potentially spears. So, you know, to get that level of accuracy, I'm pretty impressed.
That would be a very interesting area to have a look at, especially since it's not submerged. It's a major advantage over your Atlantis site.
Yes, I mean, I'd certainly like to go out there and find out what's going on, if there's any evidence for anything. That's not the only place in the Americas. And this will be really interesting in a minute, because we go to St. Louis, I don't know how you pronounce it. Cahokia is another complex of mounds and circles. And Monk's Mound, again, the largest. So I just want to, you know, I'm going to keep emphasizing this for people, that I'm not just cherry picking places. This is the largest earthwork in all of the Americas, not just North America or Mesoamerica or South America. This is the largest earthwork. So that mound to the east, which I said was possibly a modified ridge, that's, you know, that's a natural feature to me that's been modified, but this is something that's been built from scratch. And this site here, okay, this one's a bit further off. It's about 9 kilometers off of that latitude. But I think that's been done for a reason, because it's 3.33 reoccurring degrees west of that larger mound I just showed you, which is 1/54th of the circumference of that latitude, which just so happens to be 360 miles. Okay, so I'm wondering if Trump people, you know, the units of the mile could be much older than we're being told.
It's very
you get
old, and it's associated with ancient India in particular.
I think increasingly it's going to be associated with more than just ancient India, because you start to see Mara relationships in other parts of the world. But I think because that's 1/54th of the distance to the next mound, and it's 360 miles, is that trying to tell us that Atlantis is 54 degrees out of a 360-degree system east? So 360 miles from here to the other mound here, which is 1/54th of the circumference of the world. And then it's then exactly 54 degrees, or from this point here, ideally here, but this point here is exactly 54 degrees out of 360 to the east is where my Atlantis site is. So I'm
Right.
starting to wonder if that was
That's
actually built
very,
as a
very
message.
interesting. Very interesting find.
There's a lot of really interesting things going on as well, because there's a couple of interesting relationships.
So there may have been the Cahokia area, of course, that so much has been destroyed. I mean, some things were too big to be destroyed, but most of it's gone. You know, all the ancient cities that were once in the US, as Graham Hancock has documented, mostly it's just gone.
It's a real shame. I'm of the opinion that a lot of these places are almost like a rebuilding of something that came before. So I think I'm happy to say the pyramids were built 2600 BC. I don't believe they date back to the Ice Age, but I think that there were mounds and hillocks all over the world that have been built over not just once, but probably several times by subsequent groups of people.
Well, the Sphinx itself, of course, if you believe Robert Schoch, and I think it's very convincing, is much, much older.
So I think that the Sphinx enclosure, I'd be happy to say that dates back to the end of the last Ice Age. Because I'm a bit obsessed with mounds at the moment, I might suggest that rather than just the Sphinx being there, perhaps there was a mound, because we do see the strata of the Sphinx as the original strata. And if it was anything Sphinx-like at all, because of how high the water level was there in the past, I don't think it would have survived particularly well. So I think maybe there was a mound where the Sphinx is, and that's been turned into a Sphinx over time. Just something before I leave Monk's Mound, something interesting about Monk's Mound is it's 48 kilometers to Serpent Mound.
In Ohio.
That's right. It's not letting me find it. Oh, no, sir. No, it's not Monk's Mound. Sorry, I apologize. The mound that I've discovered, the semi-natural mound I've discovered in Kentucky, sorry, is 48 kilometers.
Oh, right, to Serpent Mound, yes.
To Serpent Mound here. Let me just save that there. See me doing this in real time. And then if I add another line.
And it looks as though it's directly north of something, is it? Or is that just
It's
your
not.
line? Oh, this is you measuring to the line, yes.
It's not perfect. It's about 1.5 degrees out, but I think it's not supposed to be perfectly north, is my opinion. Portsmouth.
Oh, so it is actually almost directly north from your mystery circle.
Yes, not quite, but I'm going to explain why it's not perfectly north aligned, because I don't think it's actually looking for north. There was in Portsmouth, Ohio, there was a famous group of earthworks that were in different places around here. And there's one that just happens to look like a mini Atlantis with lots of concentric rings, which has now been destroyed. Again, that's 48 kilometers away. It lay about here. Save that one here. I'm just doing this from memory at the moment. So if I join these two sites up here, let me just save it. I think that's acting as two different markers to point up towards another location, which is one we've already discussed. So if you take the difference between that angle and that angle, which is 36 and a bit degrees, I think.
Okay.
Basically, just it takes you up to I can't remember the exact numbers, but yeah, it does take you up to there. I did have this drawn out, but I don't have it in my table on the side there. But I think it's a pointer to locate the next line of latitude up.
Yes.
So that's the next 7th line of latitude. I think that's the point in that whole series of mound. I think these are two ancillary mounds. The main mound there is the one that is not really officially recognized by anyone as a mound. Hopefully it will be at some point.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you need to go there, don't you? And I think, Matt, you need to go to the States.
Yes. Definitely, yeah. It's interesting that Washington is at that latitude, and there's a lot of esotericism and occultism if you look at the sort of early founding fathers of DC. But that's just something I don't really want to get into, to be honest. But
Well, you don't have to go along. You don't have to buy the whole thing. If you just observe that the line goes very close to Washington.
Yeah. If we go back to my Atlantis site,
Have a look and see. Yeah.
it's equidistant from Avebury and the Ricat structure.
Right.
And I think,
by the way, is Avebury on a very similar line of longitude to the Ricat structure? It's hard to tell there. It's a little bit to the west, isn't it?
Avebury is to the east of the Ricat structure.
And yes,
It's not, and it's a very defined distance. It's exactly 1/6 of a radian east, and I'm talking about the sort of the ancient radian derived from 22/7. It's so if you divide that ancient radian of 57.27272727 by 6, you can work out that longitude here.
Right, so you're using pi as 22/7.
Yes, and that takes.
Which is absolutely fair enough in this context, because it makes sense if you're going to be dividing things by 7.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's worth noting is Almendris Cromlech. So as far as great circles are concerned, so great circle is the shortest point-to-point distance between any two places on a sphere. So as the crow flies, basically. So whenever I say great circle, it's if a crow was flying in a straight line, that's your great circle. Almendris Cromlech is exactly 1 radian as the crow flies to this mound as well. We're starting to see all these relationships. So I don't know if you can see the ruler box on my screen. It doesn't always share properly.
Yes. So the number's a little bit small. 6,000 something.
6,363.29 kilometers. It's my assumption that the world's.
That's 1/7.
It's
let's see.
Hold on, 6363.29. If we divide that by the polar circumference of the world, times it by 360, we get 57.25 or 26 rather degrees. So we've got a radian there yet again. I think this is like a
very interesting, Matt.
I think it's an observatory network for different purposes. I think, well, because this is within the tropics, and that yellow line there, I've drawn the Tropic of Cancer as low as it goes over its 41,000-year cycle. It goes between 22.1 degrees and 24.5, and you need a bunch of sites that are within the tropics so that the sun is at zenith, and the moon can also be at zenith in the tropics as well. The moon is a bit more flexible, but the sun is much stricter. But there'll be times where the moon passes directly over the Ricat structure, and you can use that then. Somebody in Avebury could chart some details while another observer is charting details at the Ricat structure. And then they can tell you, they can work out how far away the moon is, and they need to know details about the moon, the orbital plane of the moon, because I think that ancient people were using the moon to work out their longitude very precisely. And this is what people did.
So these have practical purposes. Now, I suppose there's no real need to be a particular distance from another site. Once you can know your distance, but it doesn't have to be a particular distance, does it? But if you're going to be making these measurements at various points, it does have a practical meaning.
Yeah, I think by having places in certain locations, again, because they didn't have irrational numbers like we have today, they had to do everything in fractions. Having them placed in a certain way means that they have an easier time doing the maths, but also I think the other thing is it points out to people that these are places of geodetic importance. So geodesy being the measurement of the Earth. It just so happens that the distance between the Ricat structure and Avebury is the diameter of the moon. Don't think that's a coincidence.
Okay.
The other, there's a similar setup in the Americas. Got it saved out.
That would be very interesting, that connection.
So we've got that Lake
And
Manicouagan
actually,
turns
that,
up one more.
I was just going back to your 54-degree thing, that the moon is the moon's diameter is 54 times 4,000 miles, I think, 2,160
Yeah,
miles.
2160. Okay, that's
So that
something
will
else to look
be,
into, isn't it?
yeah.
40, yeah, 40 times 54. Okay. Maybe that's another clue to latch onto. Okay, so there's the mound that I've pointed out here in Kentucky, Lewis County. Here's Lake Manicouagan. I've drawn a line here because you can perfectly reflect this line. Again, that line here is the same as the moon's diameter once again. But if you reflect
Right.
that triangle, if you reflect that triangle about this line, it takes you here. So this is a site that Dr. Greg Little and Andrew Collins are claiming to be a possible location for Atlantis. And
Okay.
it's definitely, something that needs to be looked into. It is, how
Round
wide
and
is
it's
it?
underwater.
It's round and it's underwater. Okay, it's a bit bigger than the site I'm calling Atlantis, but it's of the same magnitude.
So 6 kilometers across, you're saying?
6.3, yeah. Surrounded by water. It's not very deep. It would be relatively easy to search the place if it wasn't in Cuba. So that's the difficult thing. I think Greg Little was saying the reason it needs to be investigated is because there's all of these perfectly straight canals that are littered all over this part of Cuba, and I think they're known to date back. And they're known to date back to at least sort of when the natives were there before the Europeans arrived.
Right.
They're absolutely everywhere.
I've never seen those before. So they're canals. They are canals.
Yeah, they're canals, man-made canals. If you find this place in Cuba, you zoom in and take some time, you can see these all over the place. This yellow line here is the Tropic of Cancer at its lowest point over its 41,000-year cycle. It's making me wonder if they built this here for a reason, because it's a zenith point. So what it means is on the summer solstice, at culmination, which is high noon to anyone who doesn't know what culmination is, the sun is directly over this site. Whenever that period of time was where the Tropic of Cancer was at 22.1 degrees. Even though it's much further north, we can still use it as a zenith site. It's just no longer on the summer solstice. You'd have to do it on a different day of the year.
Okay.
Once the sun was directly over that point here, you could work out the great circle distance to here, for example, just by looking at the angle of a shadow cast by a stick on the floor. That would tell you exactly your sort of angular
So just to explain,
distance.
yeah, the Tropic of Cancer moves. It's traveling every year, isn't it?
Yeah, very, very slowly.
And it depends on the obliquity of the Earth.
Yes, yeah. There's three characteristics of the Earth that change over time that sort of define climate for one thing, and define I guess exactly the path of the sun over the year. So you have the obliquity, which is the angle, and then you have, so that's between 22.1, 24.5, which is 23.44 in the present day. And then you've got the precession of that, so that actually spins around on a 26,000-year cycle. And then you've also got the how that interacts with the elliptical orbit of the Earth, because we've got a very slightly elliptical orbit. I think it's when we're on one side of the sun compared to the other side of the sun, it's out by as much as, I think it might, be something like 7 million kilometers or something. It's more than you think it is. It's quite a lot. And depending on where we are in the obliquity cycle, that can determine which hemisphere gets more heat. And it's a big driver for, it's been a big driver over the last 2.5 million years for climate change, all these
I can
cycles
imagine.
interacting. I do think that is further evidence to suggest that these two sites are linked, because there is, hold on, let me just try and bring it up.
So you have a
Here we
really
go.
interesting network of places now. Oh, and now we're crossing it down into the southern hemisphere. Interesting.
Yes, basically, I've described the radian relationship between Lake Manakougan and the Ricat structure,
Okay,
and there seems
where
to
we
be a
going now?
site that has been defined to link these two places together, and that's Tiwanaku,
Okay,
which is in, I think, Bolivia. I hope it is.
yeah.
Um,
Well, that's what it says.
it's right next to Lake Titicaca. And again, people have claimed that Tiwanaku is actually Atlantis, but it does seem to be linked. It's equidistant. It's on the exact same line of longitude as Lake Manakougan, and is
Oh,
exactly
interesting.
the same distance from the Ricat structure as it is to Lake Manakougan. So it looks to me like this site has been placed to really tell people, look, these are the 2 points you need to look at for our global grid system. And interestingly, Tiwanaku was associated with Amaru, the deity Amaru, which is the feathered serpent. And if you ever go to Tiwanaku, it's something I'd like to do at some point. There is a sort of stone gateway called the Gateway of the Sun. And you see Amaru, and sometimes it's described as Viracocha, sort of emerging from
Yeah.
something or other. And he's holding like 2 different kinds of staff or stick in his hand. And on either side of him, he's surrounded by people. It looks like they're bowing down on their knees, looking, towards him in, sort of, in worship. But if you actually look closer, it almost looks like they're using these sticks. And there's half of these people have got the stick he's holding in his right hand, and the other half have got the stick he's holding in his left hand. It almost looks to me like they're doing surveying rather than worship. They seem to be
Yeah, yeah.
looking through the sticks, and I think the totem pole, the gnomon, and even in the early days, the spear was the sort of the tool that was used by the ancient geodator to determine these relationships. You don't need telescopes or advanced technology like satellites or anything like that. You can use very simple techniques. Some of these techniques were even being employed up until a few hundred years ago by European astronomers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean,
Um,
Eratosthenes was the ancient Greek astronomer. Eratosthenes measured the size of the planet to within anywhere from 50. He was out by between 50 and 200 miles, and he just used a couple of sticks to figure this all out.
yeah. Well, he also used a few books in Alexandria. I think he was a head librarian. I think he might
Yes.
have cheated slightly without quoting his sources. But I think that David Warner Matheson has also done some interesting work on this character holding the 2 sticks, and he's associated it with the constellation of Ophiuchus, who has a characteristic of holding one item in each hand, which is interesting as well. So it could also be symbolic, but as you say, it could actually be practical, like an actual tool for surveying. Absolutely.
I mean, some of the, I mean, I've seen people have done replica drawings of this gateway of the sun. On some of them, it almost looks like a sighting hole's being carved into the stick. And the top of them is pointed in a way that you could use it as a gnomon. You'd get an accurate shadow cast on the floor rather than just a stick. It's interesting. There's 2 different types of stick. And if it is for surveying, it could be one's for one purpose and one's for another purpose. And I can't remember
Yep,
the guy's
absolutely.
name, but apparently before Tiwanaku was called Tiwanaku, it was known as under another name, which meant stone at the center, which is, again, that's interesting because you get Delphi, which is, it represents the omphalos, the center of the world. This is the stone at the center. There was an omphalos stone at the Karnak temple complex. We should probably just head over to Karnak quickly now. Again, this is now on the 2/7 line of latitude. And the
these
Karnak.
centers are very interesting. Oh,
There we go.
omphalos is omphali?
Omphali, yeah, I think that's probably the plural. So Karnak is the largest temple complex in all of Egypt, and it sits at the 2/7 line of latitude. The 2/7 line of latitude goes through an alley of sphinxes. You can actually, if you go to the main temple in Karnak, you can draw a line that takes you straight through. Actually, I don't know why I'm drawing it. I've already got it saved.
So this latitude is very special too, then.
Yeah, it's another one of these sevenths. It's 2/7 from the equator. So Delphi's 3/7, Avery's 4/7. You can draw a line, great circle as the crow flies. It goes straight through. It's not like a round. It goes straight through Almendris Cromlech, and it takes you to Greg Little and Andrew Collins' proposed site for Atlantis. I mean, these are the sort of levels of accuracy we're talking about.
Yeah.
I should mention Bimini is at the 2/7 line of latitude. Again, I know Greg Little was done.
Famous human like constructed remains there, aren't they? It's famous for some steps or a road, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Greg Little's probably closest. If it is man-made, it's probably a breakwater or a harbour, because this whole thing here used to be only 8,000 years ago. All of this was above water. This sunk, about 3,000, 4,000 years after the Ice Age ended. It's very shallow. It's 10, 20 meters at its deepest. And if you imagine this is a large island, again, it's probably a little bit bigger than Ireland, where you live. But this would have been the west side of the island, and that would have been a nice place to seek shelter from the Atlantic Ocean, have a breakwater on this side. I think I have got a Bimini overlay. There it is. So I've downloaded the survey of.
Oh, you have the feature there. Is that a feature?
Yeah, I downloaded a survey of the Bimini Road, and that's its formation there.
Fantastic.
I think it is.
See it like that.
I think it's pretty definitive that it is beach rock. I've no problem with people saying it's beach rock.
Right.
I mean, you might as well use the local features. Is whether or not it's natural is the question.
Yeah.
People that have dived there are saying that they are actually balanced on rocks that are underneath, which would give you reason to suggest that it does need more investigation before it gets ruled out. But it's certainly a place that used to be a lot bigger.
And this is connected as well. So this latitude is
that's the same latitude as Karnak in Egypt.
The same as Karnak. That's very interesting. I think there are some remains also just in southern Florida. Some mounds might be on the latitude.
I know there's a stone circle, the Miami Circle. It's somewhere around here at that latitude. I can't remember exactly where it is. I've not put it on my map. It's within this region. It's really close. It's the only permanent structure carved into the bedrock.
Region. There are quite a few things.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only this stone circle here is the only permanent structure carved into the bedrock of the entire east coast, not just locally, the entire eastern sort of seaboard. Again, there's lots of lost land here. Something else, or just something I've just discovered today, which is quite interesting, is, I was looking at the largest ziggurat in the world. So, I don't know how you pronounce it, Choggezambil. Choggezambil. So this is the biggest ziggurat that's ever been built.
Mhm.
And
Sorry, where are we here? Where is this?
okay, this would have been Sumerian or Babylonian, but in modern times, it's just inside the border of Iran. So you've got Iraq
Right.
here. Iran.
Okay. Yes, I see you.
It's a really interesting site because it is exactly 54 degrees as the crow flies to the Rikat structure. It's
Again, that
just
number.
just under, and I say just under, like by 0.3 degrees or something, 54 degrees to Angkor Wat. And
Right.
although it's not a
Another very
perfect,
important site.
yes, it's not a perfect alignment. I mean, Angkor Wat has been associated with an omphalos again, just from the sort of geometry of the temple work there. You've got 54 degrees, 54 degrees. You can follow. It's not a perfect alignment. Then you can follow down to Iwanaku. It's
Okay.
almost like it's part of a survey of the extent of the old world into sort of the new world here, bypassing the Pacific entirely. I've not really done a lot of research in the Pacific, and I've not found much, to be honest. It seems like a very, because I think a lot of this was probably done by hunter-gatherers, to be honest. I think hunter-gatherers had more time than people would have had in early civilizations, and if populations were low enough.
So this is an interesting point. What kind of society, what kind of culture did these people have? I mean, there's no doubt that human cultures go back a very, very long time, whether they were settled or not, whether they were nomadic, whether they were like a bit of both going on. I mean, it's not impossible to have nomads living just a few kilometers from settled people.
Yeah,
I think the Kon-Tiki experiment proves that you can cross the ocean in a reed boat. It's possible, thanks to Thor Heyerdahl. So you don't have to have a very high level of technology to travel.
I don't have any problem with people crossing the ocean. I mean, something 42,000 years ago, something called the Le Champ geomagnetic excursion happened. There was a big sort of pole deviation. It wasn't a full flip. The pole sort of flipped down to the equator for about 1,000 years and popped back, and it meant that our ancestors had to hide in caves during the daytime. Probably went out at dusk and dawn to gather and hunt, etc. But because of that event, everyone got forced into caves, and these caves acted as time capsules, which is the reason why it looks like everything started to happen 42,000 years ago. Domestication of wolves, art, early astronomy, and I think it's been going on longer. It's just that because of this incident, the evidence has been preserved. But another thing that happened 42,000 years ago was the discovery of sort of fish bones that could only be caught in the deep ocean, and that was, I think, somewhere around this region here, in some caves around here, they found like tuna bones or something.
As well?
Yeah, in a cave. So we know people were capable of going into the deep ocean. Whether or not people were traversing the oceans is another question, but I think they were. If you look at where we came from as a species, we were quite nomadic, but not necessarily venturing from territories is the sort of the thinking. So you might be a nomad, you might be a nomad in ancient France, but you might not go, any further than the extents of, where I'm sort of circling now. Saying that, there might have been one culture of hunter-gatherers that was more advanced, and they perhaps they migrated seasonally. They didn't like it being cold in the winter, and they went elsewhere, and they may have found better territories. We do hear of
like many people today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
For the sun or for the taxes. And I think Graham Hancock has done a really good job in showing the connections that go way, way back to prehistory between modern day France and modern day United States. going back, examining the technologies that they found, the similar technologies and the arrowheads, etc., and also genetic discoveries. So there must have been contact between at least the two sides of the Atlantic. I don't know about the Pacific. There must have been contact going back several thousand years, several dozen thousand years, and also, of course, there are megalithic remains on the lovely islands that you showed us in the beginning, such as Pico. So the megalithic culture must have stretched on both sides of the Atlantic and also on those islands that have survived in the middle of the Atlantic. So that again proves that they must have been able to cross the large stretches of water.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the physical evidence as well. It's the oral traditions. I think it is widely accepted now. I think it was a bit harder to swallow, but I think it is widely accepted that the creation stories and cosmologies on both sides of the Atlantic have a common origin. I think that the accepted
That is a huge
explanation.
clue.
I think the
Yeah,
accepted
and the myths and the
explanation.
stories and the religions, their connections, these are basically cultural artifacts, and
Yes.
there are only so many coincidences you can dismiss.
Yeah, I mean, stories in the Americas of creation and mounds and sort of cataclysms that reflect what you see in the old world. But I think the mainstream explanation is that these stories traveled, across this way, 11, 12,000 years ago. Maybe some of that's true,
Yeah.
but I also think there's been migration in even more recent times. I mean, to put my conspiracy theory hat on, I'd even speculate that even 3,000 years ago, there might have been people that knew about the Americas. I think we just lost a lot of information. I'm
And
not saying
now with
people.
this age of information, I suppose things are changing because people can really look up whatever they want to look up, whether it's Google Earth or whether it's various written sources. They can. There's just so much information for people to look up. So things are changing. But do you think things are changing in terms of people being interested in Atlantis in new ways? No.
I don't know what to make of it, to be honest, because I'm on the fence with a lot of Atlantis research. To be honest, I think um, there's a lot of people that are claiming to have channeled information, yet they seem to be all contradicting each other. I don't subscribe to that sort of method of research personally. I don't have a problem with people doing it. There are people that are sort of subscribed to that and they found really interesting things. So it's not something you should entirely rule out. But um,
Yeah.
it does seem that there were some strange people around, 1920s, 1930s that, weren't necessarily the nicest people. And they've kind of become these cult figures in the, alternative history movement and even the New Age movement. I didn't realize how much, New Ageism came out of Nazi Germany. It's a surprising thing to research.
It's
I
so
think
hard to know, isn't it? I mean,
sort of going back to your original point, I think people are becoming more interested in Atlantis, but I'm worried that that's now starting to become dogmatic. It feels like there's a whole industry and law sort of cropping up around that, and I feel like a bit of an outsider, to be honest, because I'm trying to be objective where I can. I know I'm definitely biased. I've got my own biases. I've definitely
well, everyone
convinced
has their
myself.
particular field of interest and
Yeah.
scope. You've discovered something absolutely fantastic and amazing and intriguing, and you've uncovered lots of other sites around it, and you've created a whole picture that has its own logic. It's really, really compelling, and whether people go and look on Google Earth themselves, maybe they'll download it for themselves if they haven't already, and have a look and find whole new connections themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend, if anyone's interested in ancient geodesy, it's worth looking up people that you've probably never heard of, because obviously you get all the big names, and I appreciate the big names. They're doing all the work to get this, idea out there that there's something more going on. Whether or not they're completely right about their ideas or not is one thing, but they're doing the work to make it clear that, something isn't quite right with our history. I'd agree with Graham Hancock when he says we're a species with amnesia. I do think there's a missing portion of our history. I don't think it's civilization. I think I think civilization's not really what we're adapted to. I think we might have gone down the wrong path, to be honest. Not to say we throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of good stuff's come from it. And I think there's probably some happy middle ground between civilization and hunter-gatherers, and maybe that's where this kind of stuff was established. It's worth looking
Well,
at
do you
people
think
like,
maybe that's part of the problem, that we're pitting civilization against the idea of hunter-gatherers, that maybe they're not that mutually exclusive. Maybe hunter-gatherers are actually, pretty sophisticated in many ways, and in many ways more sophisticated than us. I mean, they didn't cause global warming, and they had very healthy respect for nature, and perhaps were also connected to building the Göbekli Tepe. So maybe we shouldn't really pit civilization against people who simply weren't settled.
yeah, I would agree with that. And something that I think is not really spoken about is that the cultivation of cereals actually started about 23,000 years ago. I think it sort of started in where modern day Israel is now. I think there were cases in China as well at a similar time frame where people were cultivating cereals, and it wasn't something that happened overnight. It took us the best part of like 10, 12,000 years to become agricultural people. And there's probably a time where people are sort of, there's a middle period where we're sort of half agricultural, half hunter-gatherer. And it might have been a time of, it might have been some sort of ancient enlightenment or ancient renaissance or something, something strange was going on. And this might have been the same
Yeah, I
time period
mean,
that some of this was started.
you're right. The Renaissance is not the same as suddenly things appearing out of nothing. And then that's the way that, the era of roughly 3000 BC is often presented. There was nothing, and then suddenly all these things happened, and then the pyramids and Plato, they just came out of nothing.
Yeah, I mean, you do
There's
see on
something not
both,
quite right with that narrative.
you see on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, most of the work at Avebury was done 2,600 years ago. So although it was started before, 400 years before, it started 2,600 years ago. That's when the Great Pyramid was built. That's when the first pyramids in the Americas were built. This is one of the reasons why I think there may have been, contact across the Atlantic, even relatively recently. So it's sort of going back to sort of geodesy and stuff. I think people, just to throw some names out there, obviously you've said John Michel. Before John Michel, you have somebody called, I can't remember his name now, Alfred something or other. Look up, if you search for Malvern Hills ley lines, you get the concept of ley lines that were sort of thought about.
Watkins.
Watkins, that's it, Alfred
Watkins.
Watkins, yeah. He came before John Michel. I think John Michel did a lot more work, but Alfred Watkins was out hiking on the Malvern Hills and happened to notice that in straight lines, that lots of towns that begin with the same or end with the same sort of word happen to be lined up, and he started looking at these relationships. He was dismissed as a bit of a crank. People were saying that he was talking about these energy grids, which is not, if people want to look into energy grids, I'm fine with that, but that's not what Alfred Watkins was doing, and that's what people said he was doing. Oh, he was this new ager, which he wasn't. He was talking about similar things to me, using solar alignments and lunar alignments to, set up sort of pathways and navigational sort of maps, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And there's, so you get John Michel. John Michel's worth looking into. More recently, you've got
John Michel
Robin.
is actually very, very popular still. I think he's very, very popular, and people still read his books. They still watch his talks on YouTube. I read recently the foreword to a recent edition to Alfred Watkins's book on the ley lines by Robert Macfarlane, and it was very dismissive, very dismissive. I was so surprised because I actually quite enjoy Robert Macfarlane's books, and well, I haven't read it in a little while now, but it said something along the lines of, yeah, it's interesting, a curious little book, but it's rubbish, obviously, And this is the person who's been chosen to write the foreword. So why do we have to be so dismissive? Why do we have to be so critical and not even look at the evidence? What is this culture that we're in, that if something goes against the accepted paradigm, we don't even bother considering it. That it's just nonsense.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously I draw the line at, like, people committing fraud and things like that, or snake oil salesmen. But I think we need to be open-minded about more ideas. And I come from engineering. I've it's not just how I've been taught. It's essentially regulation. I have to show my work, and we have version 1, version 2, version 3. And you look at version 1, and from sort of the sort of critical academic eye, people just be, oh, you're wrong. It's like, yeah, but that's the engineering process. I'm building something from nothing. I'm showing my working to come to a final result, and that's how I've been presenting my research. So,
but it's surprising that even people like Plato are dismissed as well, perhaps as a liar is too strong a word, but when he presents a story such as Atlantis, we're told that it's simply to illustrate a point, and there cannot obviously be any truth behind it. What would you say to people who criticize Plato's approach to telling the truth?
I think he keeps emphasizing in the story over and over again. He doesn't really do this in his other work, that this is the truth, or the best that he can recollect it, or Solon, the best that it can be recollected from the memories of Solon. And I think the reason people criticize it is because there are some things in there that are a little incoherent. And that doesn't mean he was not trying to tell the truth. And to put it from a sort of engineering perspective, it's an unfinished work. Maybe it wasn't ready for release. There's part of me that suspects that the word Atlantis simply means island, or ring-shaped island, and Plato or Solon or somebody that came before, possibly even the Egyptians, had these stories about a place called Atlantis. It may have been more than one location, and it may explain why some of these inconsistencies and incoherences are there. I do agree that he was trying to paint a picture of the ideal antediluvian state of Athens, but I do think he was trying to tell the truth as best he could. I think we need to remember that it was an unfinished work. It stops abruptly. In book 2, people have speculated there was supposed to be a third book called the Hermocrates, but we'll never know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I were trying to make a point about politics, the ideal state, I probably would compare the rights and wrongs of my model to an actual country like the UK or the States, rather than Narnia. I just think it makes more sense.
But the other strange thing with Atlantis is it's the detail that Plato goes to describe this place. I mean, he doesn't even talk about the ancient Athens as much as he does about this sort of so-called fictional place that people are saying it is. And we have to remember that it's not just Plato that talks about Atlantis. A lot of it's based around the sort of creation cosmology that we find in the Americas, we find in different parts of Africa and Europe and the old Celtic countries. And there's a particular instance, it's worth looking at. Anyone who wants to just go on Wikipedia and look for the ancient Indian story of Tripura, and not the modern city of Tripura, but the ancient story of Tripura, of these 3 cities, one coated in gold, one in silver. It rings, very close parallels to Atlantis. So I don't think he just pulled this idea out of his head.
Yeah.
So
if it was untrue, it was at least a very powerful story.
Yeah, I like I said, I don't think it's untrue, but there's probably parts of it that do get mixed up. If I go back to that point of Atlantis, we often get told, that the sort of word Atlantis is derived from Atlas. It may be the other way around, that Atlas comes from somewhere else. We get the word atoll from the Aztec, which is the Nahuatl word. It means a number of things, but it's one of the words for water or ocean.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. So that will be all connected to the ocean.
We get told there's no link between atoll and the old world, but I'm afraid I have found something that there's the word atoll, like Bikini Atoll.
Yes.
An atoll is a ring-shaped island that comes from a Proto-Indo-Aryan word. So it looks
Right.
like,
That's a really interesting connection.
and then the land part of the word, well, in the old world, pretty much everywhere outside of Africa, maybe not Greece, land just means land. So the Cornish would say land, the Irish would say land, the Scottish, the Germans,
Yeah.
the Dutch, everywhere land. So waterland or ring-shaped waterland is what I'm implying. And I think this way it could be how the story of Atlantis gets convoluted. Somebody's found all these different places called Atlantis and possibly thought they're one place.
And after all, there's no shortage of places that were submerged in the last few thousand years.
Well, yeah, exactly.
So,
I mean, we know there's submerged islands. We find them all the time, and lots of them are, actually
yeah.
diveable. I mean, there's a place, something where I've been looking at. I mean, I was talking about the 18-degree relationship earlier. So I think Mount Parnassus is actually closer than Delphi to my grid system, but it's exactly 16 degrees. Well, it's 2 degrees off being on the 18-degree grid, but if you actually work out, if you look in the ocean here in Greece, on this 18-degree grid, I found a sunken island exactly where the 18 degrees is, and it would have been above the ocean during the Ice Age.
Yeah.
It could
Again, that's another really interesting clue.
There's lots of islands that have sunk in this region here since the Ice Age. And, in Plato's story, he said, basically ancient Athens and that period, that part of the world sunk as Atlantis did. So it all makes sense.
Yeah.
We've lost huge swathes of land. I mean, you're on Ireland,
Absolutely.
I'm in Britain or in England, and there's all of this has been lost. We know about Doggerland. We
Obviously,
know
yes.
even Neanderthals were out here hunting and gathering.
Yeah.
There's
I mean,
a lot
the coastlines would have been totally different, and the UK would have been joined to France around about what, 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. I don't know exactly, but not that long ago, really.
I said before, it's worth, if you want to really start on where sort of the modern wave of sort of the ideas behind prehistoric geodesy came from, I think start with Alfred Watkins, go up to John Michel. It's worth looking at Howard Crowhurst, Richard and Robin Heath. If you look up Hugh Newman on megalithomania, he has loads of, he does his own research, but he also has, hosts shows and has lots of great guests that are worth looking at.
Yeah, so there's so much going on. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's a really interesting time, I think, what with people being able to do their own research, to publish their research, to discuss the research like this. Well, I'm just in awe of your work. I think it's absolutely wonderful, and just best of luck with the rest of it.
Thank you. Would like to do eventually is I'd like to do a website, interactive website, and you can actually start clicking on these sites and seeing how these places are related to one another with actual experiments you could carry out yourself. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to draw up plans for things like small portable equatorial sundials and gnomons and things that you could, if you wanted to, you could go out, you could go to Kentucky, or you could go to Avebury in Britain, or wherever you are in the world, and on certain days of the year you could conduct these experiments yourself and just prove to yourself that actually, yeah, I can tell where I am in the world, and I can find out where other places are by conducting these simple experiments that were likely done thousands and thousands of years ago.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. So you could actually design your own gnomon or your own tool to measure your own shadows, latitude, time of year.
Exactly, yeah. I'd like to take it a step further, where I know the data is already available, so I don't even have to do this myself, where you could have a compensation factor for the day of the year, so you wouldn't even really have to wait until a certain day of the year to take certain measurements. You could work out your latitude any day of the year if you knew where the sun lay above the equator. So
yes, yeah. So you could have tables for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Or an app. That's always an happy state.
Yeah, exactly.
Listen, that sounds absolutely brilliant. So hopefully that'll happen. I mean, that sounds like a lot of work, but that sounds really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think so. It's been great talking to you, Melissa. Thank you.
It's been fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt.